Our guest, we've been friends a long time. As I said to Mr. Schulman's history class, I actually first learned about Sojourners in 1970 when I was the press secretary to Senator Harold Hughes of Iowa, who was running for president. And one of Mark Hatfield's key legislative aides, Wes Michelson, who later became a very prominent churchman in our country, told me about this new group. That was Sojourners. It's become an amazing force in our society. And my guess is that there is no one in our country, when it comes to issues of social justice, more highly regarded than our speaker. And among those who regard him highly is the President of the United States, who turns to him often for counsel. Doesn't always follow it, but he always asks. He's been our guest on numerous occasions, and he's back this time on God's side. We'll be anxious to find out if we're actually on God's side. I will be, at least. He's a great friend, wonderful wife, Joy, who was one of the first women to be ordained into the Church of England. Two great sons, one of whom, Luke, has a promising major league career, we think. Welcome, please, the great Jim Walis.
Thank you. It's great to be back, always, with George, and we always spend most of our time talking about baseball, which we did again this morning. Julia, I would have loved to have had your introduction go longer and hear more of that talk. It's harder to be a Christian in a Christian country than other places. I hope this conversation today might illuminate Julia's point a little bit, because I think she's right. So thank you for starting us out with that. I did talk to the government class, and I said to them that the thing you know about government is that what happens inside Washington is probably the least important to our government than what happens outside, even in places far away as San Diego. So we'll talk about that a little bit today too. But I'm going to start, because it's George and all, with a baseball story. My son Luke is now in high school playing baseball, and when he was like 9 or 10, George would come to my practices and games and tell the boys, my team, that he was a Red Sox scout. And boy, did they play well. We got a Red Sox scout. I didn't know they came to 9-year-old games. But now Luke is way beyond me now. He's in high school playing baseball. But I still coach my son Jack's team. He's 10. So this is a story about Jack's team. So last season, they were 9-year-old in a 9-10-year-old league. And so naturally, we lost about 4 games. And the 5th game, we're not doing well. It's 5th inning, down 5-0. Top of the orders come up, and they've gone right down. And the bottom of the order comes up, and doesn't look good. And due to no fault of their own, 2 kids get on base. They walk. The pitches were even too high to swing at for them. So they're on base, and up steps Stefan, who's the worst player on the team, only because his parents, being DC, are internationals, and Stefan has no clue at all about this game. I mean, no clue at all. And cutting out again, right? Okay. And but somehow the ball hits the bat, and it's hit on the outfield, and 2 runs score, and Stefan is on second base. So Stefan, he's a Brit, so he's very polite. So he sees the shortstop, and he walks off to shake hands with the shortstop. And I say, Stefan, you got to stay in the base. He says, oh, I've never been here before. So that began the rally. We won 11-5. And I gave Stefan the game ball. And he was just so excited. And after the games, we have these team meetings where we talk about what do we learn today? Baseball is about the lessons of life. And so the parents always tease me and say, that's when you preach your sermons to the kids. But here's what they said. They said, sometimes what you need comes from unexpected places. Second kid said, we were all necessary for this win today. All of us were a part of it. My star player said, it just goes to show you, you can never give up on hope. So I was that weekend preaching the Virginia Theological Seminary's commencement address. So I told that story, and the title of the address was, The Vocation of the Faith Community is to provide unexpected hope. That's our job. So I took a sabbatical to write this book, and my discipline was, for 3 months, first 3 of the election year, not to speak or write or be interviewed about the political narrative, the news cycle, to stay out of it for 3 months. Very difficult for me. I spent the first week at the Camaldolese Monastery up in Big Sur, right here in California, and I had to really resist temptation. On the hill, no internet, no TV, no nothing, no cell phones. I had to resist going down the hill to see who won the New Hampshire primary. But I did, and so here's what I do. Every day, I would get up early and have quiet time, long quiet time. I'd exercise, and then I'd read and write all day. But at night, I'd watch the news cycle. The more disengaged I was, the more depressing it was to watch the news cycle. The polarization, the paralyzation, the vitriol, the anger, the fear, even the hatred and the shallowness of both media and politics. And I began to feel more than ever before how we had lost something very important. An ancient idea goes back centuries called the common good. When we just take care of ourselves and our group and our tribe and our nation, and that's all, we'll soon be in serious trouble. What it means to take care of each other and to extend this notion of neighbor out beyond our narrow boundaries. That's the common good. Now, the spiritual foundation for the common good is the second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said that right from Judaism, it's in Islam, and it's also really the golden rule in our secular democratic tradition. So this common good conversation can go across all the boundaries. So as I was reflecting on that, it hit me one day as a dad and a Little League coach. It hit me hard how you parents will know what I mean when I say this. I never thought I could love anyone or anything as much as I love Luke and Jack. And that's okay, but the commandment means I gotta love other people's kids like I love my own. That's a transformational ethic, and it was meant to be. That's the foundation of this. So I found this. And the book begins with a sentence that really expresses the hunger that so many people feel. It says, our life together can be better. Our life together can be better. And here's the quote. This is the rule of the most perfect Christianity, its most exact definition, its highest point, namely the seeking of the common good. For nothing can so make a person an imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors. That was said by John Chrysostom, 347 to 407. This goes back a long, long time. How do we have a common good conversation today? Now, we were talking at breakfast about this pin, of course, 42. This is a movie, it came from George. I've got it home for my kids. I got two more of them. Have you seen Jackie Robinson? Some of you? Okay. Now, this reminded me of what Julia said. My favorite scene in the movie is when Jackie Robinson is talking to Branch Rickey, Harrison Ford, and things aren't going well, not at all. It's very difficult, very hard. And Jackie says, why did you do this? why'd you bring me in? And Branch Rickey said, well, we ended fascism with the Second World War. I thought we should end racism now. He says, no, come on. Why did you bring me in? That's not an answer. Why'd you bring me here? Branch Rickey sits down with his cigar, and he says, I love baseball. I love this game. I've given my life to this game. But when I saw that the great Negro players weren't allowed to play in the major leagues, I understood something was terribly wrong with the heart of baseball. And I wanted to try and change that. And Jackie says, thank you. He says, no, thank you, because you're helping me to love baseball again. When I heard that, I got thinking about my own history. I was 14 years old, living in Detroit, and I came into my faith, first of all, when one day I was 6 years old, and my parents were worried because I hadn't been saved yet. They were concerned. I was 6, getting up in years. And so we had a revivalist come in, and all the unsaved kids had to sit in the front row. And he was fiery, he was scary, and he pointed, it felt right at me, and he says, if Jesus came back tonight, your mommy and daddy would be taken to heaven, and you would be left all by yourself. It got my attention. First of all, I realized I was 6, I have a 5-year-old sister to support. So I asked my mother how to fix this thing, and she told me not about the wrath of God, but the love of God. I thought, cool. I signed up, youth group, vacation Bible school, got baptized at 8. We only believed in adult baptism at 8. But I got to be 14, and I began to ask questions about my city, Detroit. Why we live the way we did in white Detroit. How life seems so different a few miles or blocks away in black Detroit. Why, I hear there are black churches, but we never had a black preacher. Never went to a black church. Who was this minister in the South named King? What was he up to? I just asked pretty innocent 14-year-old questions. They said I was too young to ask those kind of questions. When I got older, I'd understand, or they didn't know why it was this way, but it always had been this way. One elder spoke truth. He said, if you keep asking those kind of questions, you're going to get in lots of trouble. That proved to be true over time. But one night I remember, I'll never forget, the question an elder said to me, he said, Jim, you got to understand, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. And our faith is personal. I was 14, but that's the night that I left. In my head, in my heart, and in 2 years I was gone. Joined the civil rights movement, student movements of my generation, came back to faith by reading the Gospels, which I never had heard preached in my church. That's a different story. But here's the thing, and I'm thinking the students back there, I got hit hard by something happening in my city, ripping my heart to pieces. The great moral moment, challenge of my generation, my church missed entirely. Just missed it. And what was ripping me apart, they said, had nothing to do with my faith. So I said, then I want nothing to do with it either. And I left it. And I came back to it. And today, there are a lot of people, I said in the class before, the largest growing religious affiliation in the country is what? The quiz. The none of the aboves. Fastest growing. Now, I said in the class, I do love the nuns. Now, I love the other nuns too. And I said in the class how I used to go out and speak to these conservative Christian college campuses in the Midwest. And I walk into a very conservative place, and there'd be 2 rows of Catholic sisters in full habits sitting in the, and I said, sisters, why are you here? And they would say, well, we're local. We heard you're coming here. I said, yeah, but this isn't your place. I know, but it's very conservative. We thought somebody should have your back. So for years I had nuns as bodyguards, right. But I love the N-U-N-S, but I love the N-O-N-S-E. And here's what I think. If our faith, and this gets back to Julia's opening, it's real simple. If people of faith actually do and say what their faith says they should say and do, two things happen. It surprises people, and then it attracts them. The common good, as John Chrysostom says, is what we're supposed to contribute to the world, not just for our sake, but in particular for other people's sake. That's the whole point of the thing. Did you see this History Channel Bible thing during Lent? It was a big Hollywood thing from out here. It was on, and kids were watching this. My kids wanted to see it. So Mark and Roma, the Hollywood producers who did this, sent me the copies of the tapes before, some of them, to comment on. So I got the one about Jesus. He walks into the water, and Peter's out there, the fisherman in the boat. And he gets in the boat, and you know the story. They throw the net over the side, and all these fish appear, and Peter says, how'd you do that? And Jesus didn't answer. He said, follow me, I'll make you a fisher of men and women, people. And Peter asked this great question. What are we going to do? I love that. What are we going to do? And the Jesus figure in the Bible series says, change the world. Change the world. So Mark and Roma came to the premiere in D.C. and they came to see me and they said, did we get it right? That wasn't in the text, but we thought he was trying to change the world, right? So I went through Matthew 4, 5, 6, 7 and said, yeah, you got it right. The whole idea of this is a new order breaks into the world to change the world and us with it. What if Peter had said, what are we going to do? And Jesus says, well, we're going to save a few people from hell and judge all the others. Pretty exciting, I would think, right? Okay. So this book is about how indeed living this way is supposed to change the common good. And the first part's how to inspire the common good. Now, we're in this room, lots of different faith traditions, and none of all. I love these, particularly bookstores, because bookstores, people feel safe to come, And so we have people who say, yeah, I'm often spiritual but not religious. I said, that's a denomination out here, Ben Cohen, Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. Ben tells me, Jim, I'm spiritual but not religious. I said, Ben, offer him ice cream, you could be the bishop of this thing. So he's thinking about that. But people say, I'm agnostic, or some days I'm atheist, on bad days. But I wondered if I'd feel comfortable in this conversation, and I really, really do. It's great to be in your 60s and have your audiences often be half under 30 and have this conversation. It's a conversation the country wants to have. So, but as a Christian, I say to the Christians, the kind of Jesus you believe in will determine the kind of Christian you are. I've got whole chapters on this. But this is the most biblical, theological book I've written for a long time. But then I talk about how to apply it. So, chapter called The Good Samaritan Goes Global. So I'm in D.C. at the Press Club, and they're having a conference on the Congo. You're from the Sudan, Julia, but this was the Congo. And the issue was, the minerals in the Congo that are being needed to make our cell phones. They're called dirty minerals because the profits from them are being used by warlords to buy weapons to pillage the people in the Congo. So here's these CEOs and NGOs trying to solve this problem. I am the lunchtime religious speaker, which means I'm there to inspire them over their bad sandwiches. And so I said, they're eating and eating. I said, take out your cell phones. I said, no, I mean it. Take out your cell phones. So they did, grudgingly. And I said, this is your significant other. A lot of you spend more time with this than any other thing or purpose all day long. Person. And last night, when I said this in Bel Air, this one woman goes to her husband, that's you, man, that's you. This is your significant other. Then I read the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, this is a secular crowd, but they knew that story. And in the story, a lawyer asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And what you don't know in the story is this is a Washington lawyer who's asking him the question. And he's not saying, "Who is my neighbor? I'd like to help." He's saying, "Who is my neighbor? I want to avoid taking responsibility here." And Jesus talks about this man who's beaten side of the road, and the religious leaders walk by and they ignore him, but this person from a different region, different ethnicity, a stranger helps a stranger. He says, "Go and do that. Be like him." So I said to these CEOs, I said, so whoever helped to make your cell phone, whose ever lives were impacted by you having the cell phone, those people are your neighbors now on a global level. So let's talk about turning supply chains into value chains. And they stopped eating, and we had a good conversation. Young people in particular are challenging corporations, businesses, about the ethics of how they do things. Bangladesh, I was on To the Point NPR yesterday, they were talking about Bangladesh. Just collapsed this clothing factory. All these people died making our clothes. At Georgetown, where I teach, the kids won't wear T-shirts or sweatshirts or paraphernalia that hasn't gone through human rights testing. How was it made? Who did it? What conditions do they work under? It's a whole movement now about extending the level of your neighbor, and that's the whole point of the Gospels. We want to keep our neighbor to be just like us in our group. So the question really is, do we even know our neighbors, to start with? Who our neighbors really are? Do we know them? Are we engaged with them? Second, do we know our poor neighbors? If you don't know who your poor neighbors are, you got to get out of the house, because I know even San Diego, not far from here, there are poor neighbors. I'm on a book tour, so I'm in hotels every night. I'm telling you, undocumented neighbors clean my room every night. Do we know our undocumented neighbors? Do we know our Muslim neighbors? Do we know our gay neighbors? Do we even know who our neighbors are? The neighbor question, who is my neighbor, is critical here. And this, in fact, is what changes the common good. Or I have a chapter called Surprising Our Enemies. I'll just tell you this quick story. You remember when the mosque burned in Missouri this past summer, and then they attacked the Sikhs in Wisconsin? Then New York subways had all these ugly hate slogans in the subways. My team, my staff, my young staff, I was on vacation, they figured it out. They put up signs with local people 2 blocks away from the mosque. Love your Muslim neighbor. Sikhs were killed 2 blocks away. Love your Sikh neighbor. Subway signs put in the same subway stations. Love your Muslim neighbor. And what happens is, in a context of hatred and fear, reminding us of things we know to be true changes the conversation. What would that mean to change our whole conversation? I don't want to get into this unless you want to talk further, but Boston happened during this book tour. The coverage has been so shallow, and I said in the class, I'll just say it again, we can talk more if you want. How do we figure out how real and imagined grievances combine with religious fundamentalism, political extremism, emotional instability, sometimes mental illness, and let's add adolescent male rage? Let's figure that one out and not just say, who did it and how can we smash them? That hasn't worked so well. Wars of occupation have not worked so well to make my kids safer. How do you undermine religious fundamentalism, actually not from smashing it on the outside, but undermining it from within? This book talks about how that could happen. Then the second part is practices for the common good. Conservatives, liberals, and a call to civility. It's extraordinary to me. The best conservative idea is personal responsibility. That's the best conservative idea. I've lived in poor neighborhoods most of my life. I've never seen people rise, get out of poverty without taking some personal responsibility. The best liberal idea is social responsibility, and both are needed for the common good. But we have a war going on between liberals and conservatives. I've got a letter from former congresspeople here, Republican and Democrat, who wrote and said, you know, they're all formers now. We were always adversaries. We didn't think of each other as enemies. We'd agree on something one week and disagree the next week. We knew each other's spouses and kids, Little League baseball teams. Now we don't know each other at all. Gabby Giffords is a friend of mine. And I was working out one day in the gym, and I looked up, and I saw Gabby Giffords, who I'd been with the week before, was shot in the head in Arizona. Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. One of the least vitriolic members of Congress I've ever met. Members of Congress are afraid for their lives, and they call with their fears. So we've written a covenant for civility, signed by religious leaders who have different politics. Chuck Colson and I signed this together. How you disagree civilly is as important as how you find places to agree. Or redeeming democracy. While I watched the election, it became clear the checks, let me be clear, the checks have replaced all the balances in American political life. Period. Members, John Kerry you talked about. John Kerry told me once to remain in office, to be reelected, he had to raise $20,000 every day. Every day. Who do you talk to? Whose calls do you take? Who do you have lunch with? Right? And they say it with a weary voice. They'd rather read the bills they're going to vote on or talk to other people. Money in politics. Money has put a stranglehold on politics. And let me give you an example. Just 2 weeks ago, we went to the mall, clergy, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, clergy, and we planted crosses, crescents, and stars of David, one religious symbol for every victim of gun violence since Newtown. We had to plant 3,264 crosses, crescents, and stars of David. The Newtown clergy were there, and so were the Hartford, Connecticut clergy, black clergy. And one pastor from Hartford, he talked about what it means to bury teenagers. And then he talked about how he buried his own son. Then he finished and came back, and he just wept. He just sobbed. He just broke down, and the whole clergy circle gathered around him and just prayed for him. CBS News asked me what I wanted senators to do. I said, I think they should all have to walk by here before they vote. The picture was very powerful. It was Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, very visual. And 2 weeks later, 90% of the American people favored some kind of common sense changes, just even background checks and trafficking, straw sales changes. 90% of the American people, a majority of Democrats, a majority of Republicans, a majority of gun owners, all favored the changes. Washington voted against all of them, thereby thwarting democracy. And I'll be very controversial here. Why? Because the gun lobbies are supported not even by their own members, they're supported by gun manufacturers, which is why I call them gun runners. Gun runners have bought and scared Washington, and that's why there's no democracy. But the way that'll change is, let me put it simply, when children bury their parents, as sad as that is, and I've done that, that's what we expect. When parents bury their kids, something has gone terribly wrong. Clergy bury their older congregants. That's part of our vocation. when clergy are bearing teenagers, and I've done that, something's gone terribly wrong. What's going to change this long term? Parents and pastors. Parents and pastors long term. How do you redeem democracy? Economic trust. This whole chapter is about how we've lost trust in how our economic decisions are made and who's making them. And I want to say this conversation is happening at Occupy Wall Street, where I was with the kids when they started that. But also, I was 2 days later in Abu Dhabi with the World Economic Forum, where five-star hotels are having the same conversation as Occupy Wall Street. I call this the uneconomy. Unfair, unsustainable, unstable, and making people unhappy. The uneconomy. How do we take the broken social contracts we have and reestablish what the corporate people tell me we need is a new social covenant? So we're drafting that now from Davos. It's going all around the world. A new social covenant to reestablish trust in economics. Or a servant government. The wrong question is being asked about government. Big government, small government. That's the wrong question. What is the purpose of government? What is the vocation of government? I look at the Bible, I look at other traditions. There are purposes that it is supposed to fulfill, and we can evaluate that. It's not big or small. It's whether it's doing the right things. It can't do it all, but there are certain things government has to, that it's supposed to do according even to our scriptures. Finally, making things right. The biblical language for justice is always, it's about making things right. So I'm meeting young people who care about trafficking. All the women and children who are sexual slaves all around the world. Not just Cambodia, but I'll guarantee you La Jolla. Real close. It's happening right here. And they're rescuing women and kids from these brothels. And it's powerful work. It's really amazing work. But you're going to keep doing that for a long time because it's growing until you figure out how to make it right. Who's doing the money laundering? Big banks are. What politicians are deeply involved in this? Which men of power are covering this up? There are laws we could do which would help change this, but if we just keep rescuing victims and dealing with symptoms, we'll never make things right. I was at World Vision last week in Seattle, and they say, don't teach a man to fish. Don't give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. First of all, save time, do it with the women because the men will not do it nearly as well. If you want to end global poverty, fund women and girls. Larissa can talk about our Women and Girls project now. But, teach a woman to fish. Good. Who owns the pond? Who controls decisions affecting the fish, the ecosystem, and water, which will be now the most conflictual resource, more than oil, in the days ahead? Issues of justice, structure, policy, decision-making are what the Bible talks about. The longest chapter here is called Healthy Households. And George, in working on this book, I began to feel more and more how I think the decisions and choices we make in the places closest to home, those closest to us, particularly with our kids, they may be the ones that contribute most to the common good or more than really what we do outside of our households. There's a whole lot here about how to make those choices and how some of you parents might know what I mean by this, but you feel like market capitalism is aimed at Jack and Luke, aimed right at your kids, you know what I'm saying? And how Joe and I are trying to figure out how to replace values with appetite, appetites with values, how to replace appetites with values. Or we're doing family dinners a lot these days. It's so hard to do family dinners with all of our stuff. But we're trying to say, Jack, how was today? Luke, what happened? What's tomorrow going to be like? Just time. So we had a friend of Luke's over the other night, and we hold hands and going to say, have a moment of silence, and he says, wow, just like in the movies. So this book is about personal choices, household decisions. And finally, it ends with the world is our parish. I've been loving how people have been coming up and giving me, this Japanese woman says, this is the Japanese word for the things that bind us together. So this is the Korean word. Ubuntu is the African notion Desmond Tutu told me about a long time ago. The common good. The world is our parish. So the book ends with an epilogue of 10 personal decisions for the common good. I'm not going to read them all here, but it's things, a couple of them. If you're a father or a mother, make your children the most important priority in your life and build your other commitments around them. If you're not a parent, look for children who could benefit from your investment in their lives. Or if you're a person of faith, focus not just on what you believe, but how you act on those beliefs. Take the place you live seriously. I said to the students in the upper government class, seek to develop a vocation and not just a career. Ask yourself what in the world today most breaks your heart and offends your sense of justice. Join with others to change that. And since the difference between events and movements is sacrifice, also the true meaning of religion, ask yourself what's important enough to give your life to and for. And I'll end with that on this theme of hope again. Desmond Tutu has been a mentor of mine, and he really taught me this a long time ago. It comes up in this tour all the time. People say, I'm feeling so cynical about Washington and Wall Street. I don't have meetings with the president, so I feel like I can't change things. And I want to say to you as clearly as I can, skepticism is a healthy thing. Being skeptical of Washington, Wall Street, but cynicism is a very dangerous thing. Cynicism is a buffer against personal commitment. Things can't change, so I'm going to pull back and just deal with my own security. I don't want to take any risk because things won't change. That's the dangerous thing. Somebody came up last night, the husband of a woman who's doing amazing work in LA called Imagine LA. It's about homelessness. And her husband came up and said, I deal with how do I keep hope when I don't feel optimistic? And I said, Desmond Tutu helped me understand the difference between the two. Optimism and hope are not the same thing. Optimism is when your cup is half full, you're in a good mood, you're kind of a positive person, things look good today, right? That's optimism. I often don't feel optimistic. Hope is not a feeling or a mood or a personality type. Hope is a decision you make because of this thing that we call faith. It's a decision you make. And what I learned from Desmond and so many others is you see a vision of change you believe in, that is what you're seeing and that's what you believe in so much, but that's not enough. Then you got to bet your life on it. You got to bet your life on it. Hebrews says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. My best paraphrase of that text is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then watching the evidence change. Washington, D.C. is utterly dysfunctional, completely. Nothing is going to happen there in the next few months except one thing. By the August recess, I believe, I'll predict today, we will have comprehensive immigration reform. Because the common good has come to Washington. And Republicans and Democrats in the White House are all giddy. They're going to do something right, something together, something bipartisan. And they know it's because this has happened to them from the outside. And they want to do something right for a change. I said in the class, I know, and George knows, members of the Senate and House over the years who would do the right thing even if it costs them the next election. I do know some like that, but I still don't need more than one hand to count them. Most would like the right thing, but they won't unless the pressure comes from the outside. So Obama said that in Israel with students just 2 weeks ago. He said, trust me, I'm a politician. We don't take risks unless we're pushed to take risks by other people. What I'm saying in this book, it's time to understand that the choices that you make in your households, your families, your congregations, your workplaces, your schools, your neighborhoods, and your nation are the choices that will either rebuild the fabric of the common good or just cause us all to withdraw in cynicism. Our choices. Civil rights movement worked because of millions of choices people made in their lives that cost them something. And that's how it changed. That's how it's always changed, always has, always will. And this book tour is really 18 cities. We're just trying to spark a conversation about the common good. So let's have one right now. Thank you very much.
We have time, some time for dialogue. Let's see if a student first has a question. We have a hand. Julia.
So, thank you again, Reverend Wallis. I was wondering if you think that the best way for us to effectuate change is on the Capitol or through the people. What way do you think will work best?
What I'm trying to say in this book and just in wherever we go is social movements are what change politics. Abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, it's always social movements that change Washington. And almost nothing else does. So I was introduced in the class as somebody who, as you just said, sometimes gets turned to in Washington, and on my phone, when it says unknown, I always know it's somebody at the White House calling. That's their return, unknown. And I want to say that it's on immigration. For example, last June, we had the Evangelical Immigration Table, launching it on a Tuesday. Sojourners was there, not surprisingly, but also the Southern Baptists were there with us. Focus on the Family had joined us. And we had this broad coalition of people, and it got great press. And the White House wanted to meet with us that day, and we did. And they said, we're with you. And I said, your heart's in the right place, but you've shown no courage on this at all, none. 3 days later, you don't often see change happen in D.C. in 3 days. But on Friday, 7 a.m., the call came from the White House, unknown, to brief us on the president had decided to defer deportation of all young people who'd come here before they were 16, meaning they did what every kid under 16 should do when his parents say, we're leaving. You went with your parents. 1.5 million of the dreamers, young people, were finally deferred from deportation. Instead, could get work permits. And the White House said, we wouldn't have done this today if you hadn't done what you had done on Tuesday. They say, you created space for us to do this, space. That was also the day after they learned that won them back the Hispanic vote, which they were not doing well with, and that helped win them the election. But they wouldn't have done it had there not been outside space. They need two things, moral courage, but also political cover for acting with courage. So I think movements outside are what, and not just Washington, I think there's a story in the book about this young woman, I love the story. The Bank of America, they were charging a new policy at their ATMs, and she wasn't an organizational leader. She just thought this was wrong, and she did this little email. It went viral all around the world, and Bank of America backed off. They backed off. Corporations often are, and I talk to these folks at Davos all the time, they're often more sensitive to public opinion than gerrymandered security safe seats in Washington, D.C. are. So social movements with social media and social movements are going to really change things now. That's where democracy really is happening.
Dr. Gersh?
Would you call what's going on at Guantanamo, a social movement by the prisoners there to change things?
That came up in the class on Guantanamo. The president yesterday in the press conference talked about Guantanamo, which he hadn't for a long time, and it's only because of the hunger strike. The hunger strike in Guantanamo is raising the issue again, because for Americans it's out of sight, out of mind, and he sounded like he's going to come back to it again. So we've got all, whether he does, that's the question now, whether he's going to be held accountable. But we've all kinds of people who've committed terrorism have gone through our legal system and are now in jail, But these folks have never had a trial. Never had a trial. It's been a decade. So their hunger strike, them taking action. The lobbying in D.C. hasn't changed Guantanamo. But them taking action, doing, what can you do as a prisoner? I've been in jail several times, and there's not much you can do, but you can decide, okay, I'm not going to eat. Try that.
They're giving their life, as you said.
They're betting their lives on, because they're saying, what does my life mean just staying here in Guantanamo forever? So now, all kind of people there might have done some horrible things, but let's give them a chance to have some trials. So we'll see, but it's the hunger strikes. Otherwise, it wouldn't have come up yesterday at the press conference. Hasn't come up for a long time. Yes, please.
Here, and then we're going to end up with Dr. Clanton.
I think, real quick to bounce back on what was mentioned and what I brought up in class is, I think it was also the courage, if I can use that word, of the New York Times, who was very much criticized for the article they published that was translated from one of the Guantanamo prisoners. So I think in that regard, I sort of felt it was also the courage of the New York Times to publish something.
That's a good point. That's what journalism is supposed to do, right? There's some journalists here, right? Journalism has become more and more entertainment. I'm, on a book tour trying to talk about substantive things. I try to be entertaining and funny and all that stuff. But you know what? There are some shows now where you can't even get a conversation going about a serious topic. And journalists, one of the problems I feel is the top journalistic figures now. They are also part of the 1%. They're not the kind of struggling journalists trying to keep it together and doing investigative reporting and ask the hard questions. They have become parts of the elites themselves. And journalism is more and more owned by a smaller number of companies, and there's some wonderful exceptions, and we depend on them. But you know what? Journalism is often losing that prophetic role that it needs to have. And so I think the faith community has to do some of the kind of thing that journalism used to do and we depended on them for. So how do we have that conversation in the public arena about the hard questions? Okay.
Last question, Dr. Clanton.
Yeah, Guantanamo is one of the hardest questions. In the end, would you let someone die, someone under your administration die, rather than force feed them? That seems to be, to me, the big moral question of the day. It's not easy. I don't have an answer, so I'm asking you.
Obama was asked that yesterday. He said, well, they'll figure out the best. He wants to keep people alive and so on. So those are tough, ethical, kind of micro questions, and we could have some coffee over that one. Let me take, though, that issue to a little higher level of choices that we all can make. And I'll end with this story. You remember the alleged Ground Zero mosque, the big controversy? It was actually an Islamic cultural center, too close, some thought, to Ground Zero. So Imam Faisal Ruoff and his wife Daisy Khan were the ones behind that, and I was with Daisy just in New York 2 weeks ago. They're friends, and Daisy, her biggest concern before the controversy was whether there would be enough stroller space in the new center. That was her biggest concern. Then all this hit. I'd come back from vacation, so I was literally on cable TV all week long with my message of, my friends aren't terrorists. Really positive message, you know. And then the other is the pastor in Florida was threatening to burn Korans that same week. And the second message was, you shouldn't burn Korans. And all week long, I tried to get CNN to do all the positive stories out there of real interfaith collaboration since 9/11, much more than before. Good stuff going on. Finally, on Sunday morning, CNN did a story on Heart Song, this is in the book, Heart Song Church in Memphis, Tennessee, outside suburb, and they heard the Memphis Islamic Cultural Center was coming to their neighborhood. So Heart Song Church, Steve Stone, pastor, evangelical Methodist pastor, puts out this sign. Heart Song Church welcomes Memphis Islamic Cultural Center, front lawn of the church. The Muslims were astonished, came by a couple of days later and said, you the pastors? Yeah, we were hoping to be ignored. And you welcomed us. Why? Well, Jesus said we should welcome our neighbors, and we're here. You're going to be our neighbor. We don't know much about Islam. We'd like to learn. Before on the pork barbecues, we're doing halal meat. Kids were playing together, and they were tutoring homeless kids. Then Ramadan comes, and the Methodists had no idea what that was. But the Muslims said, we got this prayer thing called Ramadan. Our building isn't finished. Can we use the basement? And he said, Methodist pastor, he said, you can use the sanctuary. Wow. Well, here's CNN. The imam and the pastor, they'd now been together for a year, and you could tell they knew each other, they respect each other, you could tell they had an affection for each other. So I called Steve, I said, Steve, the first time all week I feel proud to be Christian. Thank you for what you did. He said, can I tell you what happened last night? I said, yeah. I got a phone call from a room full of men in Pakistan. Kashmir, Pakistan, one of the most conflicted places in the world. And they said, Pastor, is this Pastor Stone? He said, yes. We watched the CNN segment here in Pakistan. For a long time, we were just silent. Nobody said a thing. Then one of us said, I think God might be speaking to us through this man. Another one said, how can we kill these people? Then another man who he doesn't speak English, but I'll tell you, the voice said what he did. He went to the little church near our mosque, and with his Muslim hands, he scrubbed it, washed it inside and outside. Now we're all back together here. We're calling you. It's 1:30 a.m. Tell your congregation, Pastor, that we don't hate them. We love them. And because of what you did from now on, we're going to take care of that little church for the rest of our lives. You tell me what works in Pakistan, that or drones? It's time to have a different conversation. It's a practical conversation about how to change things like result in difficult choices in places like Guantanamo. So thank you all very, very much.
Whenever I think of Jim and I think of our friendship, it is a reminder of how much more I need to do and how much more I think we all need to do. He's an extraordinary person. It's an extraordinary witness. And whatever your faith, or you have no particular faith, if you're a fair-minded person, you will be grateful that in this country we have the voice and witness not only of Jim Walis, but of Sojourners. So thank you, Jim.